I wonder, what do you think are the kind of things that team leaders can do, IEP team leaders can do, to really make that transition planning process, and particularly the action plan, effective for kids?
So there's a few different things that I was thinking about for this question. And I think a huge piece is really preparing students and parents, as well as the other team members, that these transition conversations are going to happen, because it's a shift. Usually we talk all about what's happening in school, and we really look at the academic piece and social pieces, behavioral pieces. But by age 14 now, we're talking about what's going to happen after high school, and that's a real shift if people aren't prepared for that conversation. So part of the legislation is also that by age 14, a student must be invited to their IEP meetings. It doesn't mean that the student has to attend, but we must be inviting them. And it's really best practice to have the student there, which is also a shift for a lot of families and for team members, because a lot of times we're having some challenging conversations about the student, and people are hesitant to have the student there. But that's where, if we prepare ahead of time, we identify how the student could be involved in their IEP meeting. We make sure it's not a surprise that the day of the meeting we're saying, hey, Jill, you're coming to your meeting today. We want to make sure the student knows that that's coming. We want to make sure the parent knows that it's coming, so they aren't surprised when they see their child's name on the IEP invitation. It's also good to give the other staff members, the other team members, a heads up that the student will be there, just so they can be aware of how they want to present information. A lot of times teams that are hesitant to have the student stay for the whole meeting might have a student come in the beginning, present their vision statement, what they like about school, and have a part of the dialogue with the student. And then a lot of times they say there's other pieces that maybe the student can go back to class. And that's really up to the team and whatever the comfort level is of everyone. But certainly we want to make sure that we're preparing everyone for these transition conversations. So that's one way to start thinking and being prepared for transition. We also want to make sure that we think holistically as we're having conversations about transition. We want to make sure that we're thinking about all things, all components of the student's life. So we're thinking academically, but we also want to be thinking about socially, what is the student doing? What are their interests? Do we know if they're volunteering with their family or with their church or temple? Are they doing some things that are going to give us glimpses into what they're interested in just naturally as part of their life? So it's preparing students and the whole team to have that conversation, and then being open to that component of a conversation during a meeting, which again can be a big shift. And people sometimes get nervous. Are we going to have time to do all of this? And that's where it's important to have the mindset in that meeting that everything that we're talking about by age 14 is related to transition. So when you're talking about math class, that's also related to transition. So we don't have to necessarily section off when, okay, now we're going to talk about transition. It has nothing to do with the rest of the conversation. It's all part of transition. We're now just adding a little bit extra information that maybe we weren't gathering ahead of time. So I think as you're going into these meetings, having an open mind and taking a holistic view on the student and their experience and where they want to go is really going to make that transition planning process most effective.
I love what you said too about kind of that shift at age 14, where we're looking at things like post-secondary education, which is where clearly, schools have a really easy time connecting the math class with the post-secondary education, right? I think, schools and families can, and students can struggle with the math class connecting to employment, depending on what the interest is. But it does. And I think I love this emphasis that you are making about it's a holistic process, and all of our activities in planning for the educational elements, the IEP elements should flow from whatever the long-term vision is for the child, and having those open conversations about what this child's vision actually is.
Absolutely. Yeah. It all comes together. It's all relevant.
Yeah, and I think that being open to the conversation rather than worrying so much about where the conversation might go is important for both compliance, as you mentioned, but also for a spirit of collaboration and a sense that the student is being supported by a whole team.
Absolutely. And I think when I work with staff around how to gather information, because there's so much information that we have about the student, I rarely see there's a lack of information. It's just looking at everything through that transition lens and connecting everything back to transition. So some teams start the IEP meeting off with the student talking about their vision, and then the staff talking about the transition planning form, because that really is connected to the vision. And those, by having a conversation about an action step, it might naturally bring in the science teacher, the English teacher. But other teams just have a holistic conversation throughout the IEP meeting and don't necessarily start with the transition planning form. And really, whatever works the best for a team, use that approach. You don't have to start with the TPF. A lot of people find that's really helpful, but also the only hesitance with that is you don't want to then put the TPF once away once you've stopped talking about it, because the rest of that rich conversation during the meeting is going to be relevant to the TPF. So whenever I'm chairing a meeting, I always keep that TPF out, because there's something that might come up later that I want to discuss and put in an action plan. So that's my advice, is just keep that transition planning form out and jot things down. When we talk about age and majority for some of our older students, that might be something that you're reflecting in the IEP, but you also might have an action step in your TPF around that. So that's one of those concrete logistical things that teams will go through. Might be the paperwork part when you get closer to the end of a meeting, but you definitely want to put that in the transition planning form. So again, it's everything that we're talking about is transition. We just need to make sure that we're documenting it in a way so when everyone walks away, they understand, okay, what's the next step that's going to happen? What's my role? What's the student's role? What's the family's role?
Well, I love what you just said, because that's what I was thinking about. Like, the nice thing about the transition planning form is that you can capture things on that action plan that that can be action steps, things that can be done with dates set to them, that can be the responsibility of a student or of the family. So it's or of a community agency that might be present. And I hope that, like, I'd love to hear more of your thoughts about involving community agencies in this process, because then giving those people action steps that you wouldn't document on an IEP, because the IEP is the contract between the school and a student or family, but you could document them on a transition planning form so that you don't lose them.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great point. Again, when working with staff, the transition planning form is a mandated document, but it's separate from the IEP. So that's why it's not IEP page 17 or 18, it's TPF page 1 or 2, because the purpose of both of those documents are different. And that's something that can be a little bit confusing, especially if you were in a situation where the family wanted to reject part of the transition planning form. It's also a conversation to have with the family, again, of just reviewing. They're two different forms. You can't necessarily reject the transition planning form, but we can certainly go back and look at it and say, what do we need to adjust? But that's a really important distinction, especially for team leaders, to know that it is a mandated document. It's very important, but it's actually not part of the IEP. And that gives you the flexibility to say, the Massachusetts Rehabilitation Commission is going to follow up with the student to talk about a vocational assessment or informational interviewing by November of 2017. And that isn't something that would go in the IEP, but it's a perfect place to document it in the TPF.
Oh, I love it. What a great example with having, again, Mass Rehab take some steps that are related to vocational preparation. And they really love being involved with students before they leave school. So it's a good vehicle for making that happen.